We're discussing ethos, and before we begin, pardon the jiggle there, trying to adjust the camera, nervous habit. I thought I'd change the view for you and give you a different aspect of my office. Also, I will be referring occasionally to a couple of books. I have them sitting here, but you'll have to pardon me while I look a couple things up from time to time. So I apologize in advance. It may not happen in this particular video, but it will be happening. We're discussing ethos. Ethos, ethical proof, the proof that relies on a speaker's character. And there are three things that we find persuasive. The arguments that we find in the speech itself, the arguments contained in the speech itself. Number two, the character of the speaker. And number three, our own frame of mind or our own attitude about the subject presented, the arguments used to persuade us, for that matter, our attitude towards the speaker. But we can break it down into those three main categories. We have number one, the arguments, number two, the speaker, number three, our attitude, which is called pathos. We're persuaded by arguments, we're persuaded by the person making the arguments, and we're persuaded by our own mindset, our own attitude about those arguments. And as I said, in a subtle way, our attitude towards the person making those arguments. And that's really what we're going to emphasize here. Not our attitude, not the attitude of the listener, but the attitude but the character or the perceived character of the speaker, the one persuading. These three persuasive elements have been divided into three artistic modes of persuasion. Logos, which is the arguments, ethos, which is the speaker, and pathos, which is the attitude or mindset. When we first introduced these, we pointed out that one is direct, the other two indirect in a sense. One persuades actively, the other two persuade a little more passively. Or I should say we're not as aware. We're directly aware of the arguments that are being made, the logos, in a persuasive situation, a rhetorical situation. We're not as aware, consciously aware of our attitude towards the issue, the speaker, and so on, the topic. And just our mindset, our pathos. We're not as mindful either about the ethos of the speaker. We don't think about it as much, but it's still there. And it's there every single time you listen to someone speak or you read something that someone has written. Whether it be a textbook, some of you in rhetoric have already experienced what I'm talking about because you've had a problem with reading Aristotle, and you still have a problem with reading Aristotle. And because of that, whatever Aristotle says, you have a hard time accepting. And that's because of his ethos. His ethos, pardon me, I mispronounce it when I say ethos, but his ethos, because in your mind, he's a pagan idolater and probably a homosexual like everybody or many of the people of his day were. Though I don't know that we have evidence of him being a homosexual or not. But regardless, he's lumped together with all the other Greek idolaters, and he's bad, and so you have a hard time accepting what he said. But that should demonstrate this. There are other textbooks that you read, probably in history class, some in math, even in our rhetoric course. Edward Corbett, we don't know what his religious commitments were, whether he was committed to Christ or not, but you're not as actively rejecting him because his ethos does not bother you the way Aristotle's does. So I'm saying that these things are there. They're often invisible to us, not immediately apparent. The same thing happens, by the way, in chapel. Depending on your attitude towards certain staff members or even towards the pastor of the church. You listen or don't listen. You have a critical spirit or you don't. Sometimes based on the person. The same thing when guest preachers come in. You make judgments, sometimes superficial, or sometimes based on something he says, sometimes an impression. And then your attention and your willingness to accept his arguments are based on what you perceive his character to be, whether you consider him to be someone you want to listen to or not, want to agree with or not. That is ethos, and ethos, as I said, is more indirect. It's a passive persuasion. All three play an active role in persuading us. Don't get me wrong or be mistaken about that. But the arguments that we make, direct arguments that we make, persuade us directly. When a person makes an argument, he actively seeks to persuade another person with those arguments. The name for this artistic mode of persuasion is logos. The speaker's character persuades us indirectly. But the fact that the speaker's character persuades in a more passive manner should not make us think that it is somehow less important. In fact, as I've already spoken about, you many times won't even listen to a person's arguments because of your bias against that person. That's the idea of prejudice, that you prejudge something, and having prejudged it, you dismiss it. That's something that we need to be aware of. It is a factor. I know that these things, bias, prejudice, we're told are just absolutely wrong in every case. And yet, they're present. They're inescapable. We have these biases based on what we value, what our ethics are, our morals, or our morality, and that affects persuasion. So, we need to understand that. And so, like I said, whether we like it or not, whether we agree with it or not, it is just a fact. Our view of a speaker's arguments will be shaded and either helped or hindered by our view of the speaker himself. A well-loved, well-trusted, well-respected speaker will be given much greater leeway by you. We'll forgive his misstatements, even sometimes allow ourselves to be abused by his arguments. This fact underscores the significance of the speaker's character. The artistic mode of persuasion that relies on the character of the speaker is ethos. We refer to these arguments as ethical proofs, not ethical in the sense of morals or morality, but there is an ethical sense to a person's character as well. Ethical in the sense of Quintilian's good man speaking well. Our attitude towards the speaker and his arguments will also persuade us in a more indirect way. Again, I guess when I say indirect, passive, these things actively persuade us. Your impression of a speaker, his ethos, persuades you, and it persuades you actively. The same with pathos, your attitude, your feelings, the frame of mind that you're in as you listen, as you consider the arguments. Those things actively persuade you. Probably it's a misnomer on my part to say that one is direct, one indirect, one passive, one active. It would probably be more accurate to say that one is more obvious and the others are beneath the surface, but they still are actively persuading us. Understand that. Right now we want to examine the role of ethos in persuasion. You must consider three things regarding your ethos. Three things regarding your ethos. Number one, you must consider yourself. Number two, you must consider your appearance. Number three, you must consider your language. All three play a role in ethos. So first, you must consider yourself. In any piece of discourse, you present a character to your audience. Now, you're not presenting a character as in, John Wayne playing a cowboy. That's not what we're talking about here. Your audience sees you and either knows your character already or is trying to figure out what kind of character you are and what kind of character you have as well. You present a character to your audience. Some of that character comes from the reputation you bring to the table. Some of it is established in the discourse itself. Pardon my interruption. I need to say this real quick, and then I have to take care of something, so we'll come back. I was saying that in a piece of discourse, you present a character to your audience, and some of that character comes from the reputation you bring to the table. Some of it is established within the discourse itself.